Jeff Zwerink again with Give and Take. This is the segment of our show where we explore challenging and interesting scientific ideas to help equip you to be more confident in the truth of Christianity. Today we're joined by particle physicist Mike Strauss, and we're going to answer the question, if we find an explanation for something, does that mean that God's not involved? Mike, it's good to have you on the show again.
It's always great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So kind of give us a brief update. I know you do particle physics at the University of Oklahoma. What does a particle physicist do?
Well, the main job of particle physicists is to try to understand the fundamental structure of the universe. What are the smallest particles in the universe and how do you put them together? And so we use these big particle colliders to smash particles together, see what comes out, play with fun toys, and understand the structure of the universe.
So the very nature of what you do is trying to find explanations for what happens. And so I can see where, as a Christian, that all may generate a little bit of a conflict or at least tension there, because often we seem to say, well, in these areas where we can't explain, that's where God's involved. So how do we wrestle with that where we're trying to find explanations? And if we do, does that mean that God is no longer involved?
I find this is a common misconception among both believers and non-believers. The idea is that if I can mathematically explain something or explain it through natural means, then somehow I've removed God from the picture. But that doesn't seem to be the biblical idea of how God works. In other words, God is only involved if a miracle occurs. Mm-hmm. But throughout the Bible, we see just the opposite. The Bible says God feeds the lions, and ancient people knew that lions were not fed by some supernatural meat from heaven, right? And so the idea is that God does things in lots of different ways. Sometimes he does miracles. Sometimes he does things through just natural processes, like feeding the lions. And sometimes he does things through maybe hypernatural processes, things that seem so improbable, but they happen anyway. So when I look in science for an explanation, I'm not looking for a natural explanation that will remove God, but a natural explanation that will explain how God does something.
So I want to come back to the kind of that hypernatural and natural explanation and how that kind of plays out. But your statement there seems very important for this reason, is that if God's only involved in the miraculous, then there's all this other stuff that's going on where he's uninvolved. And that seems a very unbiblical picture of who God is.
Yeah, it's certainly unbiblical. Jeremiah says God formed him in his mother's womb. Well, did Jeremiah know how he was conceived? Of course he did, right? So every person that believes in God would say conception is a natural process, but God is still involved in the outcome. And I think that's super important. And so there's this indictment against Christians that if I say God did it, I somehow stop scientific investigation. Mm-hmm. But that's not true. If I say this looks designed, therefore I believe a designer did it, that says nothing about how the designer did it. And certainly as a scientist and a believer in the Bible, I think most of God's design is implemented through natural means, but it still points to a designer.
So what are some of the areas where, we would argue, we see evidence of design or a beginning or something like that, where we're still looking for a natural explanation, and let's kind of wrestle through some examples is what I'm looking for here.
Certainly one I use a lot is that the universe had a Big Bang beginning, and as the universe expanded, you have to fine-tune the amount of matter in the universe. If you have too much stuff, the universe collapses in on itself really quick, and if you have too little stuff, the universe expands really fast and you can't get galaxies and all.
So presumably if it collapses back on itself, you're not going to get galaxies, stars, planets, we're not going to be here. Or if it expands too rapidly, you're still not going to get the stuff clumping together, no stars, galaxy, planets, and we're not here.
No particle physics.
That would be a shame. Yeah. So we've got to get just the right amount of matter, because that regulates the expansion at some level then.
And that amount was fine-tuned to about 1 part in 10 to the 60th within the first second after the Big Bang. So some people would say, well, that must be a miracle, but we think we have a mechanism that makes that happen. A mechanism called cosmic inflation forces the matter density to be what it should be. But this is a finely tuned mechanism of itself. It's like a machine that works just perfectly. Well, if you have a mechanism that works so finely tuned to accomplish a purpose, doesn't that still point to a designer?
was thinking, we do this in other places. I mean,
Absolutely.
I put gas in my lawnmower quite often.
Yeah.
And there's this little hole, gas glugs out, but I also have this very finely thing called a funnel, which takes that gas and makes sure it gets in the tank.
Yeah.
The fact that it has to get in that little hole and I've got a mechanism for getting it doesn't mean that mechanism isn't designed. Is that kind of what you're getting at
Yeah, I
here?
love the gas analogy because it's just like cosmic inflation. It forces something to a very finite value, but it's clearly designed. And so, we see this in all areas. If I find a natural mechanism, but the mechanism itself is so well tuned to do the job, that points to a designer.
So what we've got in inflation there is we've got this thing that appears very finely tuned, that if it were other than that, we wouldn't be here to talk about it. And so it matches that. Our universe matches that expectation. But yet we also have a mechanism that produces it.
Right.
And so your contention is just because we have a mechanism, that gives us information on how God did what had to be fine-tuned. It doesn't remove him from the picture. It just gives us more information on what he did, if you will.
And there is a misconception among, again, believers and non-believers that when I find the mechanism, I don't need God anymore. And I think we as Christians need to try to avoid that kind of argument, that because it looks so finely tuned, God must have done it miraculously. What we really need to ask is, because it looks so finely tuned, there must be a designer. Now, how did the designer do that?
So let's look at another one. We did another episode where you talked about the strongest scientific evidence for God, and you were talking about how that there's a beginning to our universe.
Yeah.
I spent enough time doing research in there to know that people are still looking for an explanation for why there's a beginning to our universe.
Yeah.
Are we dealing with the same sort of thing there?
Yeah, there's lots of, it's all speculation. We really don't know, but there's a lot of speculation to look for a natural cause to the beginning of our universe, as if somehow, if I can find a natural cause, it would remove God. And my contention, based on what we've talked about, is that wouldn't remove God. This universe has a beginning. That's what we believe as Christians. That's what science has shown us.
And that's what the Bible says.
And that's what the Bible says.
But
But nothing says how God brought this universe into existence. And so the how could still be a natural mechanism that's finely tuned, tunes the entropy, tunes the matter density, tunes everything just right. And that could be how God did it. And if we find that, it'll point just as much to a designer as maybe a universe that was miraculously brought into existence.
As Christians, we often have this mindset that God only works in the miraculous, that where we can explain things, God's not involved. The challenge with that is that the more we explain, moves God into a smaller and smaller corner. But yet the Bible talks about God being involved in everything, from feeding the lions to forming us in our mother's womb to creating the universe. Whether God uses natural process to bring that about, or whether he uses miraculous process, God is still involved. And we can be confident that as we continue to explore and understand and learn about this universe, that more and more of that evidence will continue to point to God's involvement. And that is a great confidence we can have as we go out and share with others the good news of the Creator and how he wants to relate to us.